It seems that Israeli politics today is degenerating further and further down. And the reason is because the opposition in the Knesset is very weak. It lost massively in the last elections. However, when it came to the reforms last month, we saw a massive surge in popularity for the opposition. And that was because they managed to get all the people out in the streets almost rioting against the government. And so now the new precedent for politics is to just attack the government no matter what. And this is, of course, something that can't be blamed on the opposition. This is what Benjamin Netanyahu did in the last government, and that's how they actually managed to take it down. That was Bennett and Lapid's government. And however, this doesn't mean that this opposition should be doing it at every sector, at every possible point, especially when this could actually harm Israel's future. And the reason why this is all kicking off now is because the government is going to propose a new law that will lower the exemption rate from 26 years old to 23, maybe even 22, 21, for yeshiva students from ultra-orthodox Haredi backgrounds. Up till now, these yeshiva students from Haredi backgrounds, they learn in yeshiva and then they reach 18 and they have to now draft. Then they get an exemption from the yeshiva if they learn. And then once they reach 26, they are then fully exempt and they can usually go out and go into the workforce. However, they are a massive disadvantage if they go out into the workforce because they have no qualifications and they have no experience in any skills that, for instance, high tech or construction even. And so this disparity that we touched upon a couple of weeks ago that was reported by the OECD report is going to be the next issue that Israel's economy has. And so that's why the government now is trying to propose a new law that will lower the exemption rate to 23, and that will give them 3 more years to get more experience, maybe even start studying, be able to build up their portfolios, their careers, and we'll be able to integrate the Haredi community better into the workforce. And before I pass judgment on whether this is a good bill or a bad bill, we should understand that beyond this just being another way for the opposition to just get more political points by bringing people out into the streets, there's a lot behind this that's been going on since 1948, since the creation of the state, and even beyond. And this is mainly the HAREDIM and the army. And so there are 2 main reasons why we should look at that the HAREDIM don't draft currently. The first is values. Since the state was created by a socialist and a socialist party, this is Ben-Gurion and Mapai, the rabbinical authorities have always been at odds with the secularism of the state. They want a Jewish religious state that has democracy or that has any other form of government as long as it's a Jewish state. And the government at the time wanted a government that had Jewish roots. And so this contradiction meant that the rabbinical authority of the HAREDIM were at odds with the state on many occasions. And so to try to bridge this gap, Ben-Gurion himself exempted the yeshiva students from the army to integrate the HAREDIM better into the economy so that the Jewish state will be able to survive and thrive. And so why wouldn't they send them to the army in this case is because many rabbis and parents saw the army as being under the direct command of the government and therefore would have a lot of influence over youth, and they were worried that the government and the army would try to influence their youth to leave their religious values and become secular and therefore would sacrifice their future. And so they opposed the draft for their own students in order to keep their way of life that they saw was under threat. And because Israel is a liberal democracy, that means that it is a democracy, the majority should rule, however, minority groups have rights. The HAREDIM are a minority group, so it's not so simple to say, oh, well then they should just give up their lifestyle in order to protect other Jews. No, because their lifestyle is protected under minority rights. And to try to force them to draft would actually infringe on their minority rights, especially if it goes against their religious beliefs. And the second reason why the HAREDIM don't draft is because the army doesn't want them. And although that sounds incredible and ridiculous, it's true, and hear me out. The first thing is that HAREDIM have a very specific lifestyle and very strict observance laws. And an example that we can give, a very small example, is milk and meat. From when they eat meat, HAREDIM do not consume any milk products, some from 1 hour and some till 6 hours. And in the army, lunch is usually meaty proteins, and dinner is usually milky proteins, and this means that many HAREDIM would have to wait 6 hours between lunch and dinner. That doesn't sound a lot, but in the army, every time frame has to be far planned in advance. And currently, the schedules of the army is not so easily flexible to just now allow for 6 hours in between, especially when the food can go bad. And so if the army wants to draft 11,000 new HAREDIM every year, then they were faced with 2 solutions. The first is to change the whole army in order to accommodate for these 11,000, which will need massive amount of brain power and manpower that the army can't really sacrifice. The second is that they'll have to create a new logistical center specifically for the HAREDIM, in essence creating 2 armies, one within the other, that has its own set of laws and its own observances. And again, this will just harm the uniformity of the army. And that uniformity is something that is so effective in the IDF. And another reason why the army doesn't really want these soldiers right now specifically now is because the army needs more combat soldiers rather than non-combat roles. This means more active people with guns rather than people sitting on computers, and intuitively we can understand that a person who sits and learns all day is not going to be very active and is more prone to injury and won't be able to carry as heavy as a load. And so the army knows this, and they already have an abundance of non-combat roles. They need more combat soldiers. So they know that their target population is not the Haredi community. And therefore, with these reasons combined, we can understand that the army doesn't really want Haredi draft, at least not right now. And by the way, quick side note, there are Haredim who do draft, and there are 3 places they go to. Nachal Haredi was established for this, however today it's mostly not Haredi, and that's why they won't go there. Tomer in Givati and Chet in Sanchanim in the paratroopers. These are 2 small units, they're companies size of up to 80 soldiers in total who have drafted into combat roles, and these are small for 2 main reasons. The first is because the army wants them to be small. They can't really handle such a massive group of very Haredi religious soldiers. The second reason is because the army and the government have not been able to persuade the rabbis that Haredi youth could draft and still keep their values. This maybe could be seen with these 2 small units in the future, but for the moment it's just not a viable option. And with this in mind, we can understand that this bill is trying to at least help or alleviate the issues that could come about if the status quo continues. If the Haredim are not the target for the IDF to draft right now, and although they might be in the future, then the status quo currently is only going to disadvantage a very large growing population that will actually harm the economy on the higher end. And therefore, what the government has tried to decide is to balance raising very needed pay packages to soldiers, increasing better equipment, and making the army a much more effective fighting force, rather than increasing its numbers with people that the army doesn't necessarily want. And so with this balance, the government is proposing this bill. And once again, the opposition is calling out to go to the streets against this bill. And as I said earlier, one of the reasons why is because this is how they can stay relevant. There is also a last argument that we should examine given by Benny Gantz, and that is that the army is a national unity tool. And that means that everyone drafts and they become part of the society, and that is the point of the army. However, I don't think that argument holds up at all to examination, because you can't really force people to unite nationally, especially when there are exemptions to other sectors in the Israeli society. And also the point of the army is not to promote national unity, it's to protect Israel and its existence. And it doesn't really have any more manpower or brain power to do anything other than that currently right now. And so we should distinguish what is claimed to be harmful for Israeli society from what is actually just a power play by certain politicians trying to keep power and momentum going for themselves.